welcome. There is nothing you need to bring with you to be welcome here. No right beliefs, no proof of citizenship, no eternal optimism or clarity of conviction, no boundless courage or endless expertise. You do not need to know what brought you here or how you will solve that problem you're turning over and over and over in your mind. Your bills do not need to be paid, and your checkbook, or whatever it is these days, can be a mess. Your children may have been up half the night, your hearing aids may not be working, your knees may be creaking today. You do not need to be already perfect or even halfway to belong in this place, where, as Anne Lamott reminds us, grace meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us. This place, where love resides in each of us, yet is somehow more than all, where life still pulses and rages and heals and transforms, creating us and this new day anew once again. Come, let us worship together.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Berkeley. My name is Don Close, and I'm your worship associate for this service. This is a welcoming community. We are always working on how to better welcome and care for one another. If this is your first time, we're so glad you've come. And whoever you are, we welcome you in the fullness of who you are. As we begin, we want to acknowledge that this church occupies land in Huichin, the unceded territory of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. We understand that we continue to benefit from the seizure and occupation of this land. We acknowledge and embrace our responsibility to take restorative action. We affirm that this is deeply felt and commit our congregation to be in right relationship with Indigenous peoples, aligning in solidarity, supporting Indigenous projects, and caring properly for the land. Now take a moment, please, to prepare yourself and your space for our time together. You might get a candle and a way to light it so you can join in the chalice lighting at home. Now let us kindle our flames with these words. We seek our place in the world and the answers to our heart's deepest questions. As we seek, may our hearts be open to unexpected answers. May the light of our chalice remind us that this is a community of warmth, of wisdom, and welcoming of multiple truths. We also pause to remind ourselves of some of the foundations of resilience. We light a candle of courage, a candle of acts of service, a candle of fellowship, and a candle of hope. May we find and cultivate in ourselves and one another Now please join with me in saying our covenant. Love guides this church. The quest for truth and justice is its common purpose: to give thanks, to listen deeply, speak with care, honor our differences, and seek and grant forgiveness. These things we covenant with one another.
Good morning. I am Ken Marino, your ministerial intern. One of the pleasures of being here at UUCB is learning about the Ohlone people, their stories, their food, and their daily lives that they lived here on the land that we occupy. The coyote is central to Native American mythology. You'll hear stories all over the Americas of the coyote. The English word is derived from the Spanish coyote, which is actually a pronunciation of the Aztecan Nahual coyote. There's a TL at the end of that word, and as you'll see in the language as well, and from what I understand, it was appropriated in the Klingon to give it a flavor. The coyote is known as a trickster, and when you read the stories in the indigenous stories here, you kind of recognize Wile E. Coyote, and so I'm pretty sure there's an appropriation there of Wile E. Coyote from these stories. In the story of the buffalo, for example, it is the sneaky coyote who opens up the door of the corral and lets the buffalo out into the Americas. During the summer, it was not appropriate to tell coyote stories. So when the winter came along and it became cold and people came inside, they told the stories of the coyote. And if you had done it before that, it was thought to be bad luck that could bring illness on both the listener and the teller of the stories. Now in this story, we hear about some of the food that the Ohlone ate, including acorns, berries, and various vegetables and meats, huckleberries, strawberries, and grapes. Women collected wild onions and carrots and mushrooms. And they also caught fish, scallops, clams, oysters, and they made pinole, which is a sweetened flour made from dried ground corn. Acorns were a staple of the Ohlone diet and contained tonic acid, which is poisonous. So they would need to clean the tonic acid out of the acorn flour by pouring water over it. And this would take hours to do this, to make it safe to eat. So the coyote is at the center of the creation story. And a long time ago, there were no human beings, but there were two spirits, one good and one evil. The two spirits made war upon each other, and at last the good spirit overcame the evil spirit. At that time, the entire world was covered with water except for two islands, one of which was Mount Diablo and the other Mount Tamalpais. The coyote sat atop Mount Tamalpais. He was the only being living there. And one day the coyote saw a feather coming towards the island. And that feather turned into an eagle. And the eagle and the coyote became friends. Eagle told Coyote that he should find a wife and populate the world. But Coyote did not know how to do that. "How do you make children?" asked Coyote. Eagle did not want to reply. He wanted to see what Coyote would do. Coyote considered making children in the knee. Eagle sat back and laughed at him. Next, Coyote tried to make children in the elbow. The eagle once again sat back and laughed. Then in the eyebrow, and finally in the neck. Eagle could not keep quiet. He was laughing so hard, Coyote looked at him angrily. Hummingbird was also watching at these attempts of making children and could not refrain her laughter as well. Finally, she told Coyote, "This place would be good. Try the belly." Then Coyote went off with the woman and said, "Louse me." The girl found a wood tick on him. She was afraid and threw it away. Then Coyote made her look for the tick. Look for it and then eat it. Then the girl put it in her mouth, swallowed it, and she became pregnant. Coyote and his wife had 5 children together, and these children became the 5 tribes: Ensign, Ramsean, Akaya, Kokonta, and Wakaranis. He told them to go out and populate the world. They did, and they founded the 5 languages. Now, Coyote gave people nets to carry. He also gave them bows and arrows to kill rabbits. And he said, "You will have acorn mush for your food. You will gather acorns and make acorn bread. Gather it when the tide is low and kill the rabbits. When there is low tide, you can also pick albones and mussels to eat. When there is nothing else to eat, then gather the buckeyes for food. If the acorns are bitter, wash them out. Gather grass seeds for pinole. Carry them on your back in a basket. Look for these things of which I have told you. I have shown you how to gather food, and even though it rains a long time, people will not die of hunger. Now I am getting old, and I cannot walk. Alas, for me." Later, Coyote and Eagle were joined by Hummingbird. This became the trinity of gods who created the race of people. The animal gods are sacred, but are still a part of our everyday life. This is the story of the coyote.
Now we take a few moments to turn ourselves inward into ourselves and inward into the heart and hearts here in our community. This is the time when we lift up the joys, the sorrows, the challenges, and the concerns that we may be facing and we may be carrying. During our time of silence this morning, I invite you to share any joys or sorrows or significant milestones of your own in the comments section. And after the silence, I'll share aloud any that are shared during our live stream. I invite us all to hold these cares in the compassionate embrace of this loving community. Please join me now in silence. Amen. Please join with me now in the spirit of meditation with this reading. In the struggles we choose for ourselves, in the ways we move forward in our lives and bring forward our world forward with us, it is right to remember those who gave us strength in this choice of living. It is right to name the power of hard lives well lived. We share a history with those lives. We belong to the same motion. They too were strengthened by what had gone before. They too were drawn by the vision of what might come to be. Those who lived before us, who struggled for justice and suffered injustice before us, they have not melted into the dust. They have not disappeared. They are with us still. The lives they lived hold us steady. Their courage and love can evoke our own. We, the living, carry them with us. We are their voices, their hands, their hearts. We take them with us, and with them choose the deeper path of living. Let us join in now singing our meditative piece, Spirit of Life.
At UUCB, courage to face harsh realities and take restorative action is a pillar of our Unitarian Universalist faith. Consider the Widening Circle of Concern project. It challenges us to become more aware of ourselves and calls us to be accountable by taking anti-racism and anti-oppression action. The WOWS group, Whites Opposed to White Supremacy, has engaged many of us in the hard work of rooting out white supremacy attitudes and biases. Our Honoring Indigenous Peoples group, called the HIP group, is exploring the impact of settler colonization on the original peoples of the lands we now occupy. And the question, what does this entail for our moral responsibilities now? The land acknowledgement was conceived and proposed by this group. Our state of California has a grim early history. Before the European settlers arrived, the West Coast had the densest pre-Columbian population anywhere north of Mexico, with hundreds of indigenous peoples groups. They had lived here for some 14,000 years with abundant natural resources and immense diversity, with some 500 distinct subtribes with 100 distinct languages. The arrival of the European settlers in 1769 was cataclysmic. An estimated population of 310,000 native people fell to about 150,000 in 75 years. Massive deaths were caused by European diseases, destruction of the habitat that sustained native societies for thousands of years, and wanton violence against whole communities. Their numbers fell even more rapidly in the worst period, the first 3 decades of California statehood. Worst because of the stark immorality of what is known as the California Genocide. By 1900, Native California survivors numbered between 15 and 20,000. Benjamin Madley, a UCLA historian, wrote An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. He describes in excruciating detail the near annihilation of the native Californians and how state legislators created laws that encouraged and granted virtual impunity to those who attacked them. He called it a state-sponsored killing machine, the wholesale massacres of entire native villages. This history touches me personally. My great-grandfather was a sheriff in Colusa County in the upper Sacramento Valley during some of the genocidal years. His name was Joseph Byron Stanton. What role did he play? Did he participate? I don't know. But he was a law enforcement officer, and the genocide was formally encoded in California law. Malcolm Margolin spent decades learning from the Ohlone peoples who survived and are preserving their ancient cultural ways. Malcolm is a contemporary writer and publisher in Berkeley, and is probably best known for his book, The Ohlone Way, Indian Life in the San Francisco Monterey Bay Area. Malcolm emphasizes that the Ohlone peoples were especially peaceful. Like in other early societies, Ohlone conflict was ritualized and restricted. Malcolm identified characteristics of the Ohlone that supported their generally peaceful culture. I believe we would do well to emulate them, to guide transformations in our own society today. To mention a few, the Ohlone achieved a sustainable relationship with their environment, in contrast to our extractive plundering. They had few outcasts, in contrast to our large populations of prisoners and homeless. Relative egalitarianism, no large gaps in the possession of wealth and power, moderation of individual power, and economic security attained through networks of family, friendship, and social reciprocity. In facing the darker aspects of our histories, we must take restorative action when we can. And we would also do well to heed historical models, such as the Ohlone, that affirm humanity and sustainable harmony with the natural world, our home. May it be so.
Thanks to everyone who's helped to make this service that we are celebrating now come into being, both our singers, our musicians, our folks speaking, and our fabulous tech folks who are in the back of the sanctuary. You won't see them on camera, but they are helping to make this happen. It is so great to be able to be here online with you all today. So the story of Helen Keller is a popular one. She was born blind and deaf in 1880 and spent her first years in complete isolation. That isolation was finally broken by persistent teacher Annie Sullivan, and the story, as most of us have probably heard it, ends at the water pump when Helen finally realizes that Annie is spelling the word water under her hand and spells it back. That sound familiar? Yeah, go ahead and respond if you're in the sanctuary. Okay. Did you also know that Keller was a political speaker, a suffragette, a supporter of birth control, a socialist, a labor rights activist, as well as being outspoken on deafness and other disabilities? She met every U.S. president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson, participated in marches, opposed military interventions, and overall was considered radical and quite ahead of her time. But yet, the stories we typically hear about her end when she's still a child. They end at the water pump, when that's barely where her story has begun. This month, our monthly theme is Holding History, and we'll be taking a number of different perspectives as we take a look back at various forms of our history. So today, more of an overall look back and re-seeing some history. I'm going to have some fun completely demolishing some of our favorite children's books. Next week, we're going to talk about the history of the lighting of our chalice here in UU congregations on Sunday mornings and other gatherings. Then we'll talk about a little about the history of our earth and the rampant capitalism and consumerism. And finally, finishing the month, really grappling with pieces of our history that may be hard to hold. But let's start off and let me demolish some favorite tales, right? Recollections of history, both what we hear and tell, and especially what gets taught in our schools, recollections of history are full of what, let me call it, fake news, including omissions as well as certain slants that come from the perspective at the time they're written, or even worse, are written to reinforce that perspective. Dominant culture rewrites history to reinforce itself, erasing what doesn't fit, kind of like a large-scale example of how we remember what we want to remember. You know the book Where the Wild Things Are? Not the movie, but the book it was based on. So here's this fabulous story which was innovative for its time because of, instead of illustrations being in a little box, the illustrations spilled to the edge of the page that went across the centerfold in the book. It was the first time that had happened. But let's talk about the story. In Where the Wild Things Are, energetic Max, who didn't like rules, went and sailed on a ship to a land filled with fierce beasts, and he tamed them and became their king. He is wearing a white beast suit, and the beasts are all colorful and full of line drawings. You hear the metaphor here? This was, at the time it was written, overtly intended as a story of colonization. Max in the white suit who goes and tames the beasts and becomes the ruler. Then you have Babar the elephant. If you look back at that, it's much the same as well, an overt story of colonization. And then there is the book, The Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, particularly Little House on the Prairie. I admit I grew up loving the Little House books. I've read them all many, many times. And not too long ago, I found my first copy of the first one, with a note written in pencil in the front of it from a friend who was moving away, and gave it to me as a going-away present. I estimate maybe first grade, judging from the quality of handwriting. Little House on the Prairie was definitely a product of its time, and largely shows a story of the westward expansion, of white settlers forcing the Native Americans off their land that they were taking over. When they got to it, Laura reflects that, and I assure you I'm quoting here. Laura reflects, quote, "There were no people there, only Indians." That line has been much debated to be changed in later editions, but the next quote has stayed put, even in current printings of this book. Pa explains to her, "This is the way it always goes. Settlers move in, the Indians move out." And Laura says, "Why? Don't worry about it. It's just the way things are." We could go on and on about why this book is even in libraries today, but there's something even more troubling about it. This exact book, Little House on the Prairie, was translated into a variety of languages and sent by our government to other countries as an exemplar for American values. This is in recent times. This is not long ago when it was written. Sent to other countries as an exemplar and model of American values. And looking at how so-called Columbus Day is still so widely celebrated, maybe this story is still an accurate model of American values. But that doesn't mean that we have to be okay with that. It doesn't mean we have to sit back and watch the oppressive and dehumanizing acts taking place in the World Theater and the National Theater all around us. How I want to propose today that we go about doing this is to take a step, to take a pause, and to re-educate ourselves. We've been swimming in the water of these omissions and misconceptions for so long, it can be hard to see the water for what it is and to change our impression of it. And I surely, as enlightened as I might think myself, I surely still find out new things and new interpretations all the time. It is our moral obligation to do so, not just once, but over and over again, peeling back the layers of this onion that we may not even know exist, and continuing our own spiritual evolutions in the process. So what are some of the ways that we can re-educate ourselves? And don't worry, I'm not done with children's books yet. I'm coming back there. Some of the ways that we can re-educate ourselves. First, we have to work to correct false assumptions that we may have. Now, these assumptions, they may come from different places. They may be history or facts that we were taught or told at some point, often by a well-meaning person who believed them themselves. They may be conclusions that we ourselves have drawn either earlier on when we're still trying to figure out how the world works, or as we've gone about living our lives, also trying to figure out how things work. I remember going through this process myself back when I was an undergraduate. I had been raised Southern Baptist in a deeply conservative household, gone to a religious school, all the way elementary school, middle school, and high school, and overall had rather narrow visions of a lot of things taught to me. And it wasn't until I got to the more diverse community of my undergrad campus that my own re-education process started. The two things that I remember most at that time were my religious re-education. As you can tell, I'm no longer Southern Baptist by any stretch. And also the way that I thought, the way I had been taught to think about LGBT issues. And I have come a long way, but still have plenty of evolution ahead. Assumptions can really get in the way, and readily have, throughout our history. Did you know that after definitive results were published about how eating citrus fruit cured scurvy, it still took more than 50 years before that really got implemented? And here's another one. Seat belts were invented long before the automobile, but weren't mandatory until cars until the 1960s. The first confirmed death from asbestos exposure was recorded in 1906, but it wasn't banned until 1973. We've got a lot of history of not learning things very well, don't we? Something else we need re-education on is how we see and treat other people and how we see and treat ourselves. I remember an amazing article in the Huffington Post that was on obesity and changing assumptions and changing beliefs, challenging beliefs about obesity. And I commend it all to you. In it, they tore apart assumptions about obesity, especially one of the more pervasive ones, that it's someone's fault that they're obese. That one assumption drives perceptions of folks who are overweight and how they're treated to an extent that should boggle our minds. And even when folks are presented with evidence to the contrary, it continues to drive how we see one another. And most importantly, it drives how folks see themselves. Even with lots of public research on the fact that diets don't fix obesity, so many folks report on how often they receive unsolicited advice about what they should try and diets they should undertake. We need to re-educate ourselves and keep re-educating ourselves on these assumptions, these false conclusions that drive the way we see and treat others, and also the ones that drive and influence the way that we see and treat ourselves. Another area for our re-education is in the way that folks are dehumanized and even blamed. These are justifications for countless oppressions, many of which we keep seeing ongoing in the world around us. Okay, y'all ready for another beloved book? You ready? Curious George. Let me sketch out the story and see if you can follow along. The man in the yellow hat goes on a trip on a ship from the United States to Africa. While there, he finds a monkey that he names George, no matter what the monkey's name might have been, and decides that this monkey is of use to him. Maybe he can make some money on this monkey. So he tempts the monkey with his yellow hat. When the monkey gets close to it, the man captures him, ties him up in a bag, and takes him back onto the boat. George is taken back across the ocean. He even tries to escape while he's on the ship. The man saves him. He's taken back across the ocean and put to work by the man in the yellow hat. Anyone seen the metaphor? The middle passage. An uneducated, savage monkey was captured and forcibly brought across the ocean to be put to work in this country. George is dehumanized even further in that in every single story about him, he never speaks. The whole curious thing is another matter, too. He gets into trouble because apparently he doesn't know any better. He's too stupid to know better is how he's portrayed. How many generations of our children have heard this story? Dehumanization and oppression taught over and over will continue these oppressions in various forms. The blaming and the justifying are another thing, too. And seeing it when it comes across in front of us is so important. I remember this in particular in a tiny little news story that flitted past one day, which I only noticed because it happened where my parents and my brother's family live. It was so tiny, it only made the local news, but it is truly connected to a larger picture. It happened at Soddy Daisy High School near Chattanooga, Tennessee. And the assistant principal went on the daily video news at the high school to explain their rules about athletic shorts and the gender differences between what the rules were. Here's what he said to validate the rules, and I'm quoting him. If you really want someone to blame, blame the girls because they pretty much ruin everything. They ruin the dress code, they ruin the clothes. I mean, ask Adam and Eve. You can really go back to the beginning of time. It'll be like that the rest of your life, so get used to it, keep your mouth shut, suck it up, and follow the rules. This is disgusting for so many reasons, not the least of which is that there were female student leaders organizing in his defense. He's a popular coach, after all. This rhetoric of blaming and so many other things. But this rhetoric of blaming has to stop. Rape is not the fault of the one who is the victim of it. Domestic abuse and domestic violence are not the fault of the one who's abused. And not bringing up a painful story from your past until much later doesn't make it any less real. Now, one thing, while I'm here on this topic, slight soapbox here, bear with me, because this needs to be said over and over. For the male-identified folks tuning in, the mansplaining is a problem. It's usually pretty bad overall, but also seems to get worse when there may be a powerful gender-based issue going on. Think back to however many times in the past however many years. The mansplaining gets worse. I can't tell you how many times I've said, ouch, as a result of something obvious or insensitive said by someone who is male-identified. And the re-education about this has to come from other male-identified folks. And that's what I'm calling on you for. Calling out the locker room talk, calling out the mansplaining, calling out the insensitive comments, and holding other male-identified folks accountable for learning different ways of being. And it's not just mansplaining. There is so much research and so much literature on the fact that domestic violence will largely only end if male-identified folks are the ones to really challenge it. Please, for the sake of your female-identified friends and loved ones, please help and do your part in this re-education. There are legacies of oppressions reinforced and perpetuated by their own virtue, as well as by the ways they are remembered and talked about. We've talked about how they're reinforced in beloved stories that even as a UU, I read to my daughter when she was younger. Where the Wild Things Are, Curious George, I even got her copies of the Little House books. I didn't see them at the time for what they were. And there are plenty out there that I'm still looking at and going, whoa, have I really been reading this and didn't see it? There is the perpetuation of assumptions and blame that back up deeper oppression still. Look at the way that racial oppression plays out in each of its iterations. Now most clearly seen in sentencing in our prison system, but in subtle ways pretty much everywhere. There are things whose impacts are passed down from generation to generation. For instance, the multi-generational impact alcoholism can have on a family. There are legacies and legacies of oppressions, ones we didn't start, not even close to, but ones that we can learn to better see and thus be able to start countering. One of these ways these legacies play out is even in the language that we use, the words we use to describe things. And even though this is foundational, it is also a powerful way that we can learn and practice some different ways of being. Because we use words every day, so how better to start with little reminders to ourselves? So some examples. We'll start with God. How about that? God as a topic naturally comes up a good bit in things like churches. One thing that theologically progressive churches have struggled with are the gender pronouns that are used for God. The conservative ones and even mainstream ones pretty much use masculine pronouns exclusively. But the progressive ones have been incorporating feminine pronouns or even nonspecific pronouns and ways of referring to deities a number of years ago. Unitarian Universalists were early adopters of this trend, and I've heard folks tell that this is the very reason they decided to try us out, or the very reason they came back if they did, literally because of our inclusive gender pronouns. Language and changing language is a powerful thing. We've had plenty of other intentional work going on in our faith related to language. Specifically, some of the recent pieces related to language referencing specific physical abilities. I remember the first time I really met this effort was when I was helping to plan a worship service for our General Assembly, our national continental gathering every June. I had submitted a first draft of the script for the service, and the feedback I'd received asked me to change the "please rise as you are able" to "please rise in body or spirit." Let me make a confession. I rolled my eyes. I may have literally said, "What difference does it make?" Well, the one way was how I had heard in my congregation for years, and it seemed more inclusive than "please stand," "please rise in body," or "please rise as you're able." But still, I wasn't all that open to reconsidering. But here's the thing. I needed to reconsider. We need to keep reconsidering. We need to keep growing. Ever going through the spiral of our own spiritual and personal growth. Now, despite these efforts, it wasn't until many years later that the anthem of Unitarian Universalism and our motto, "Standing on the Side of Love," got challenged. Standing. Differently abled folks began immediately troubling it, but it was years before they had much success. It wasn't until much later that change began to happen. The composer of the piece, Jason Shelton, recommending substituting it with "Answering the Call of Love." And we've gone through quite a few different iterations of the motto nationally as well. I can't remember what it currently is. I admit, though, the first time I heard it getting changed, I rolled my eyes too. I'm still working on myself with that. There is a vast amount of re-education needed. A vast amount. And this is a responsibility for all of us. It's an obligation if we're serious about the values we say we have. For those in a dominant paradigm, whatever that paradigm perspective may be, it is their responsibility, our responsibility, to re-educate ourselves on the issues and the oppressions, to challenge them and dismantle them where we can. And what I'm calling for, this re-education, is a countercultural act. It is a challenging one, it's a powerful one, but it's a hard one too. We are swimming in a sea of oppressions, and we need to not only see the water, but do something about it, because it is poisoning us, and if we don't, it will forever hold us back. It'll hold us back from creating the world we dream about, unless we can find ways to do something about it. May it be so. Now we get to sing some more. Doesn't that sound great? So our singers are coming up. We'll have the words on screen, and I've got to flip back to where I've got them. Got it noted? No, it's not singing. It's an offertory. I'm wrong. Excellent. So Don will come up, and then we're going to have some fabulous music while we share with each other.
As we commit together to making this a loving community, we take time to remember that UUCB needs our gifts and support. We invite you now to make an offering. Each week, half of our offerings are shared with the Good Neighbor organization, who needs our financial support. And we hope you will continue to practice generosity with them during these difficult times. This month, our good neighbor is the Segorite Land Trust. Segorite Land Trust is an urban, intertribal, women-led trust that facilitates the return of indigenous lands to indigenous peoples. Through the practice of repatriation, cultural revitalization, and land restoration, Segorite calls on native and non-native peoples to heal and transform the legacies of colonialism and genocide. One of the projects Segorite is working on now is Lijan, an East Oakland traditional village site, and the first piece of land rematriated within the territory of Huichin. Lijan is a California native ceremonial space. It is used to cultivate traditional and medicinal plants, and is also the location of the first Hemetka emergency response hub. Hemetka in Chochenyo, means in one place together. Offerings of any value are received with gratitude. Details on how to give electronically will appear on your screen as the offertory begins. Thank you. Now please join me in dedicating our offering. We dedicate our offering and ourselves to the mission of this congregation, to create loving community, inspire spiritual growth, and encourage lives of integrity, joy, and service.
It has been so good being together today, even virtually. Before we shift to our time after the service, I recommend you check out all the things that are available here in our congregation, explore our website, uucb.org, and check out our week ahead email. And as we prepare to end our worship, a couple of things to remind you of. Our food drive this year will not be during the month of November as in years past, but will be December 11th. So be on the lookout this month for information about it and how to be able to donate. And I hope that you will tune in after the service for a very special LFDMC, so Literature, Film, Drama, Music contingent, after the service today, which will feature a special presentation from our Honoring Indigenous Peoples group. So check out the week ahead and our church website for the link to that. It'll be a great presentation. And now we do get to sing. Let's join in singing our closing song, Our World is One World, and I believe you'll even have the lyrics on screen.
Our
Our closing words are from Alice Walker. Love, if it is love, never goes away. It is embedded in us like streams of gold in the earth, waiting for light, waiting to be struck. May we ever answer the call of love that reaches our ears and our hearts, finding it and spreading it throughout our world. Blessed be.